Hello, I'm Dan Raviv, and welcome to the Quest for Significance podcast, exploring various aspects of a book I've had the privilege of writing with my senior co-author, Professor Arie Kruglanski, who's based at the University of Maryland, a leading expert on human motivation. Our book is titled The Quest for Significance: Harnessing the Need That Makes the World Go Round. It's published by Routledge. If you want to buy it, we'd be very happy, of course. It's available at all the usual places where you buy books these days. Today, with our guest, Dan Rothstein, we'll look for connections with education, communities, and democracy building through the right questions. But first, Arie Kruglanski, considering your work on significance, how it's an almost universal need that just about everybody feels a need to achieve some dignity, respect, some significance, make their lives matter. We will likely see some overlaps with matters of education, Dr. Dan Rothstein's work, which includes promoting learning to advocate for themselves to make democracies stronger. Are you?
Yes, well, I think that the interface, the connection is between the quest for significance and Dr. Dan Rothstein's work is very strong indeed. The quest for significance is, as you said, the need to matter, the need to have respect, the need to have social worth. Everybody has it. It affects our life on a day-to-day basis, but it also affects the lives of groups of people who, by dint of their social identity, feel disempowered, feel discriminated against, feel left out of the game, and under some circumstances, these people find the power in themselves to unite and to fight for their dignity. And this creates social movements. It creates revolutions. It changes the face of the world. Examples are, Black Lives Matter, the feminist movement, the LGBTQ movement, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the American Revolution. In all cases, a group of people felt disempowered and therefore fought for their place in society, fought for their rights, fought for their significance. And I think what Dr. Rothstein is doing is attempting to empower people, because we know in psychology, just having the need does not quite empower you. You have to have a way to satisfy that need, to satisfy and satisfying the need for significance is to having power, mattering in society. And through empowerment, Dr. Rothstein efforts increase the significance of the people. They are now willing to participate in democracy, to change, to have a vote, to have an impact. Without it, we are like children. Without it, we are belittled. Without it, we are diminished. Without it, we refer to an autocrat, to a big daddy to guide us, as it seems to be happening in our country and around the world today. So this empowerment of people is a step toward democracy, against autocracy, against being, little children guided by a superman or one who presents himself as one. And in that sense, it's a very important way of training significance, and the relevance of Dr. Rothstein's words to our concern is indeed very, very important.
That, of course, is Dr. Arie Kruglanski, distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland in the psychology department. But I know you've lectured all around the world about the impact of this, whether we're talking about terrorists or even we're talking about philanthropists and just the kind of people that we meet every day. Let's turn to our guest. Happy for the opportunity of a wider audience to meet you, Dr. Dan Rothstein. You're the co-founder of RQI, the Right Question Institute, and I know now you're directing the democracy building programs based at RQI in the Boston area for decades now. I know with worthy partners, Dan Rothstein, you've brought QFT, the Question Formulation Technique, to many communities and schools, not only here in America. And with your co-founder, Luz Santana, you've written two books. One of them is called Make Just One Change, teach students to ask their own questions. I understand it's selling really well. And partnering with parents to ask the right questions. And you're working on a third book, and you're teaching also at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So, Dan Rothstein, I've known you for more than 50 years. Most of your work and academic studies have involved the phrase, the right question. So, Dan, explain how questions are at the core of what you do and teach.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Arie. I know, Dan, that you and I share the initials DR, but I don't use the word Dr. Dan Rothstein. I'm very happy to be Dan Rothstein, just so that you know. So thank you for this opportunity. And I think that what you said at the beginning, Arie, really captures the parameters within which we are thinking now. That what happens to individuals has a connection to what's happening on a societal level. And I think that your angle, the way that you were thinking about significance has a lot of relevance to work that we've been doing. In some ways, it gives a name to something that we've observing, but we didn't have a name for. So I think that's that's very powerful. And I think that we entered this work by listening to parents in one community, low-income parents in a low-income community in Massachusetts, who talked about not wanting to get involved in their children's education because we don't even know what to ask. So we're very smart. It only took us 1,000 or 2,000 times of hearing that. And then we finally realized, well, there's something there. So we'll solve that problem. We'll give them a list of questions. They don't know questions to ask. 1 week, it was about their children's homework. The next week, it was about discipline policies. And we began to see that the pattern is that they kept on coming back to us. We were working as part of a dropout prevention program, my colleague Luz Santana and I. And we were actually creating dependency. And that was the opposite of what we wanted to do. So we realized that they had named a problem that nobody really had ever paid much attention to, which is how important, how significant is the obstacle of not knowing what to ask as an obstacle to participation, to making your voice heard, to feeling like you can make a difference, to any sense of efficacy. So they had named something really profoundly important. And then we got to work on, well, how do you teach what really is a very sophisticated skill that has learned the two of you as accomplished journalists and academics know is serious work of coming up with the right questions. And you know that it takes work and you get better at it as you get more experience with it. But how do you teach this very sophisticated skill to all people, no matter their level of education? So it took us a while to do that. And we tested out different ways of doing it. And one of we began working with parents and began to see that sense, there was a new sense of agency that people acquired when they learned to ask their own questions. And if you think about it, we've all been in situations where we might have been in a doctor's appointment and we leave and we say, oh, that was the question I should have asked, right? And it provokes a physical response. That was the question I should have asked. Well, why does it provoke a physical response? Because there's something very significant that happens in the brain when you do figure out what question you are asking. And it just was really striking to us about how few people were really paying attention to the teaching of the skill of question formulation. So long story short, we did that work. We began to develop a strategy for teaching people how to formulate their own questions. We began to see how they applied it in many different settings. Sometimes the parents we were working with told us, well, we didn't use it at the schools, but you know what? When we went to the welfare office and we told that our benefits were being cut off, we used it there. When we went to the job training program, we told that there's only a certain kind of job we could be trained for. We used it there to ask about what were other options. And we began to test it out in many different environments, primarily working with disempowered communities, people who were far from power. We even did a session with incarcerated people in a prison in Massachusetts, where an adult literacy instructor had learned about our strategy and said, we think this would be valuable for the men in our institution. And there was some skepticism about whether that could work there. And they invited us in. We came in. And we use something called a question focus in our process, where people have, instead of asking a question to invite people to respond to, we present a focus for them to ask questions about. And we have a structured process for them doing it with certain rules for producing the questions. And so the men in the group began to do it. And the question focus for them was, we're being released in 6 months. And then they just went through the process of asking questions. And then they kind of work on their questions. They look at the difference between open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. They practice changing them. They see how you ask a question changes the kind of information you get. And then they chose their priority questions. And one of their priority questions was question number 9. And question number 9 was very interesting. It was, how do we use our street smarts for good when we get out of here? So I would say that that is a question that connects to significance in the way that you've described it. And it connects to agency in the way that we do our work, that it promotes agency. And so what was also really remarkable about this is that very often in our process, people discover, oh, I can't answer my first question or my second question until I've answered my 12th question or my 13th question. And never before in their lives have they ever produced 13 questions. So there's a discovery there. And we see this particularly with students. Students, it's just fascinating to see. We've seen applications of our question formulation technique with students from kindergarten through postdoctoral researchers. And invariably, it comes out that people say that is one of their biggest discoveries in the prioritization process, is figuring out that, oh, there's actually some questions that I should be addressing first before I address these other ones. So there's a certain kind of sophistication that develops very, very quickly. You also appreciate this in an academic environment. We had a National Science Foundation grant, and we were doing work with some graduate students in the biology department at a elite university, a very well-known university. And one of the doctoral students was going through the process, and it was focused, and they created their own question focus based on their own research topic, what they wanted to study. And at a certain point, she stopped and she came up to us and she said, who's going to see these questions? And I said, well, we're going to look at them just to understand better how the process works for you. She goes, well, I hate to say this, but sometimes people steal ideas from each other. And I just came up with a question that could really shape my research, and I don't want anybody else to see it. So it was just very interesting to see that this is a doctoral student who's very sophisticated and doing high level work. So there's a lot of power in asking questions and figuring out the right questions and formulating questions. And we've continued to see that it promotes a certain sense of agency that is so often very, very difficult to foster for people who are accustomed to not knowing, to being in positions without power, to being dependent upon others, to be unsure about how to navigate systems or how to advocate for themselves. So I think that there's a certain power that comes with knowing how to formulate your own questions. Now, I'll make just one other point here. We emphasize the word formulate rather than ask, because it's a process that we teach, which begins with producing questions. Then you do work with your questions, like looking at closed and open-ended questions, changing them, prioritizing questions, thinking about why you prioritize those questions and what did you learn by going through the process. So you're basically using divergent thinking, convergent thinking, and metacognitive thinking in one process. And it's really remarkable to see this work for people in all sorts of communities and settings and different levels of education. I just did a presentation for a group of fellows at Harvard University a couple of weeks ago who actually come together to talk about how to improve teaching and learning. And for them, the fact that you could insert metacognitive thinking into a process has major implications for what their students are able to learn, because the students can become more conscious of their own thinking and what they need to do. So I've talked a lot about this in terms of that growth, the learning, the development, the sophistication that happens. So how does this connect to advocacy? How does this connect to democracy? So to advocacy, we need to know how to advocate for ourselves. Question formulation, being able to ask questions, is a fundamental element of being able to advocate for yourself. So if you say that we don't go to the schools because we don't even know what to ask, then you've named a fundamental problem that needs to be addressed. Doesn't solve all the problems, but it makes it possible to begin to work on the problems. Then, in terms of democracy, you can see that what is it that authoritarians most want to prevent? They want to prevent questioning of what they were doing. So they certainly recognize the power of questions. They certainly recognize the need to limit people's ability to ask questions of them, and they do not want to be questioned. So conversely, we should then look at, so what should be essential in a democracy? It should be people confidently, actively, assertively asking questions about decisions being made. So what we have done, we have created something called a why vote tool, where has been used in a lot of communities where voting percentages are very low traditionally. And it basically allows people to make connections between services that they need or that they use and decisions that elected officials make. And so it basically increases, when they make that connection, we then have them ask questions about voting. So they actually now want to know more about voting and about different positions that candidates take and how it affects the issues that are important to them. So it opens the door to seeing connections between their lives and the decisions that elected officials make. So we've tested this out in a few places. We wish that it could have reached more places, but we just didn't have the capacity to do that. But it does elicit very interesting responses where people say, I didn't realize that I can make a difference. That connects to significance. I didn't realize that I need to make a contribution. I need to do something. It's important for my family. It's important for my community. Another feeling where this is significant, this is important, I need to participate. So that discovery of the need, that sense of urgency to take action, has a lot of potential for building greater democratic capacity. So I've said a lot, brought in some examples, but I'd like to turn it back over to you.
Especially to you, Arie Kruglanski. I just love these podcasts we're doing in the Quest for Significance series because we're picking up so many different angles. It's what we tried to write in the book too, but like here's real life, right? Knowing that people require a sense of significance and how helpful that can be when they also recognize it in each other. Arie?
Yes, I think, I'm amazed as to how important it is. And I'll give you an example from my own teaching experience. I'm teaching a course on the psychology of extremism. And in the course of the lectures, I have invited some really renowned speakers from all over the world. And I encourage the students to ask questions because, for one, the speakers feels very badly if there are no questions. That kind of implies total lack of interest.
Yeah.
And the students, but the students, even though I encourage them explicitly, please track what the speaker is saying and ask questions. And these are, These are seniors, juniors at the University of Maryland, smart kids, and they are patently unable to ask questions. It's very difficult for them. So, the skill of asking questions is something that needs to be taught, needs to be exercised. And you've discovered that very important thing, because just by saying ask questions, it does not happen. And that's
Yeah.
now to the importance of it. I think, first of all, asking a question manifests that you are an intelligent person that is able to understand the material, to analyze it. So that in and of itself is very important. The content of the question is also important, especially when it comes to voting, when it comes to participating in the democratic process. You feel not only that you have asked a question and therefore you are significant by dint of that, but also the kind of questions you ask that has to do with your participation, your improving the fate of your fellow members of the community, your families. So that in and of itself gives you a sense of significance. So, it's double whammy in a sense. You're just the sheer of your being involved and having a voice, having something to say is very important. And then the content of it, in many cases, in and of itself. For example, what you talked about in terms of the released prisoners. We have done a lot of research on released terrorists in Sri Lanka and other places. And a major question that they should ask is how they can contribute to the community once they're released. And, in addition to asking the question as such, the content of the questions gets them to think what they can do in order to gain the significance that they had as fighters, as terrorists, gain it through peaceful pro-social means. So I
Yes.
think you are onto something extremely important.
Yeah.
I have a
Thank you.
question for you,
Yeah.
Dan Rothstein. Pardon
Can I
me that
just,
it's a little bit
Dan, can
on.
I just respond? Can I respond to Arie's
Of course,
comment
go ahead.
first?
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So the Arie, your point about the work with terrorists being released back into society, I think that there are probably a lot of efforts that encourage people to think about what are you going to do? What do you think about this? How you do this? Questions being asked of them to get them to think, okay, which is fine. And that is actually the universal model that is inviting people to do thinking about it, and that's fine, and that's good use of questions. It is and this is the difficulty we have in describing the significance of what happens when people ask the question themselves. One of the adult educators in the prison where we worked observed what happened, and she said, we can tell people that message that you should use your smarts for something good when you get out until we're blue in the face. But it's a whole different story if they ask that question themselves. And I think that what you named, there as that example that's the small but very significant shift we would like to encourage is how do you give people opportunities to ask the question for themselves?
My question was going to be kind of on the negative side of this, because in our book, The Quest for Significance, we write about what can happen when there's a loss of significance and how dangerous that can be. People might even turn to violence or self-harm, even suicide in some cases. So, Dan Rothstein, I'm wondering if you've seen that also in the communities, schools, different environments that you've brought your question formulation technique to, and you've realized that there was some frustration bubbling up that could have been dangerous.
Well, it's interesting because we have heard at times that people have been reluctant to teach the strategy because they say, well, what happens if people go in and they get shut down or they get penalized for asking a question? What are the implications for them? So the negative side has been more about what is the danger of asking a question, or what is the risk, or what's the price of asking a question. And so our argument has been that if the choice is between not teaching people how to advocate for themselves, not teaching people how to ask questions, um, versus preventing them from doing that, we'd err on the democratizing access to the skill, even if there's a risk there. So that's kind of been one negative concern about it. The other, I'm not quite sure how to address your concern about the negative implications of asking a question.
I mean, your answer was perfect
Yeah,
because you told us
Well,
what you encountered, Arie.
yeah,
can I weigh in here? I think that the strategy of autocracy is exactly that, to intimidate people
mm,
from asking questions, right?
mm,
Using fear, punishment, ridicule, all of
right,
that. And I think one possible way of counteracting that is kind of vaccinating people against that, knowing
mm,
this can happen. But
mm,
it's important for them to know
mm,
that's what their antagonists are going to try to do. Uh,
mm,
Knowing that this can happen and still recognizing the importance of their empowerment, of their asking the question, how important it is. Maybe that kind of self-awareness, metacognitive, you may want to
all
call it,
right,
self-awareness of what the interactive process might look like, may vaccinate, may encourage people to ask questions, even though they might expect to be punished, to be shut shut down, and so forth.
yes, yes. Yeah, I like the immunization idea that basically you really want people to be able to develop an immunity to being shut down.
Now, we
That
only
Right.
that
have about 2 minutes left, and
yeah.
so I'd like both of you to weigh in on this by asking a question, by formulating what at the Right Question Institute you call the right question, Dan Rothstein. Um,
Yeah.
are uh, are the people in the community, in the group, who've learned to ask questions, are they assigning still great respect and giving greater significance to the authorities whom they are asking? Do we have to seek some kind of equalization? Is there anything perhaps bad about the fact that folks in the community who didn't know how to ask questions still have to say, please, sir, please, ma'am, give me an answer? Any problem with that, Dan Rothstein?
Well, I think that once you turn on the switch of agency, you can't turn it off. Once people feel that I have a right to know this and I want to know this, and I'm actually equipped when given an answer that I am not satisfied with to be able to ask another question, um, that you're basically building a capacity there for people to think and act on their own behalf. So it levels the power relationship greatly. And there are some people in power who don't like that, and there are some people in power in lots of situations where we've seen this used teachers who said, I've never had meetings with parents like parents who've gone through this process. Doctors who said, I've never had patients before come in so well prepared to talk with me, and with their own questions. And you have public officials who say this really helped set an agenda that is stronger because it comes from the people in the community rather than just from me. So a lot of that falls on the people with greater power, with greater authority, is what's on them. Do they welcome democracy? Do they welcome participation? Or do they want to retain all authority to themselves?
Arya?
Exactly. I think that, by asking questions, people exhibit their power, their intellect, their agency. And I think that in many cases evokes respect from the other side, even though it may be begrudging respect, but in
Yeah.
many cases it's a good-willed respect, and promotes a kind of interactive process, co-investigation, opens the minds, opens the discussion as opposed to it being so unilateral and one-sided. So I think that can be very productive social process as well on both sides of the aisle, so to speak.
Well,
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, gentlemen, that we're out of time for this episode of the Quest for Significance podcast. Big thanks to our guest, Dan Rothstein. Please look for
Indeed.
his books and keep an eye out for his work on behalf of the Right Question Institute and the Question Formulation Technique. So much that overlaps, in fact, I know, Arie Kruglanski, you'd agree, with our book. As we found, our book is The Quest for Significance, Harnessing the Need That Makes the World Go Round. And please tell your friends about this podcast, audio and video. You can find it on the usual podcast platforms. Till next time, I'm Dan Raviv. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.